Hey, Professor. This is Kyron Christofferson. You've met me plenty of times over email, but not in person or anything like this yet. So you get to see me, you get to know who you're talking to. Briefly, let's go over the timeline. Number one, presentation creativity, 20%, sufficient amount of data. Including composers' dates, significant global events, 20%, clear distinction of eras, including the dates with the era titles. I do have the dates. I will send you a better photo. I also plan on flipping this so that you can see the video, the writing in the video. So right now, well, it's not important. Anyway, I'll be flipped. But yeah, I have the dates set up in there. Descriptions of the eras and styles. Off to the left. Well, my left, maybe it'll be your right. Anyway, spelling and accuracy of information. I never misspell stuff. However, it might look like it. The markers are very permanent, so yeah. I hate doing typing stuff like we talked about with that first essay. I really dislike it. So I've done a lot of PowerPoints already in my life, and I already had a big one this semester. Was not really feeling another one, so hopefully you enjoy this. This is my timeline presentation, starting a minute and a half in. Nice. Alright, so obviously there's six main eras that we talk about in this class, right? I mean, there's more, but it's not really that important as far as progression in music, especially considering the fact that it's not written down anywhere. We really don't know, right? Anyway, medieval era, the first one at the top here. So that was from 476 to 1450. What that means is from the death of Romulus Augustus, which is like the last Roman emperor basically, which is funny. But yeah, so he died in 476. Fall of the Roman Empire, that's the general date. And then the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Pretty basic. Now let's talk about what was going on. There's basically just a lot of monophony, a lot of choirs, a lot of singing, not a ton of instruments being used, not nearly anything compared to what we have today or even in the Baroque or Renaissance era, but started with Pope Gregory I. He was the Pope. He was known for cataloging a lot of the music. The Gregorian Chants, basically the main music of the medieval era, where it was named after him. They just very monophony music that was very monophony. Anyway, I'm going to be struggling with some of these words. Monophony. Lots of monophony in the Gregorian Chants because it was just one melody or one stream of music. They were all just chanting it, right? Anyway, so that was about 600 AD. Moving on to about 750-ish to 800, just after 800 AD. Charlemagne is a huge person. He really helped to bring a lot of that music in together and to basically catalog it as well. Right after Charlemagne, about 850 AD, you had the notation of the pitches and the rhythms. So that's when they started to learn how to standardize their way of notating music, and so that allowed for stuff like the melismas. It allowed for more complex music. It was still pretty basic, and it was still very basic. I mean, polyphony music didn't even start until later than that. But moving on to about 1000 AD, we had Greedo Arezzo. He's famous basically because he was a teacher and he was able to teach people to sing in a good, strong, replicable. Basically, people could repeat it over and over again, and that's he's where do re mi came from, and learning the pitches. And then you had the Hildegard of Bingen, and she was the first known female composer. She did a lot of chants as well, but she started experimenting with the chants. So she's known for that, kind of building on the Gregorian chants. They had Leonin. He was another artist or composer. He did a lot of polyphonic chants. Right about then, about 1200 AD, polyphony became a big thing with Hildegard and Leonin. Moving on to about 1300 AD, we had Guillaume de Machaut. I'll just say like an American, Guillaume de Machaut or something. Because if you mispronounce on purpose, you can't get in trouble, right? He was known for his sacred music at the time, but honestly, most of his music was secular. He had a lot of great love songs, stuff like that. Anyway, fall of Constantinople happened about 150 years later at 1453. So now we're going to move on to the Renaissance era. Honestly, recap for the medieval era: monophony and a little bit of polyphony. Polyphony at the end. Polyphony is just when you have two streams of music, basically two melodies going on at the same time. Moving on to the Renaissance era. Just time check. Oof. I think it's a little quicker for you. I don't want you to sit there all day. Anyway. Whatever. So I'll talk about the green is the special things of the era. I can't forgetting the word. Anyway, Renaissance era is largely polyphonic music. The sacred genres like mass and the motets. The secular was like the madrigals. As far as art goes, the Renaissance era was a rebirth, basically, of the Greek classical times. It's not classical era, it's a Renaissance era, but it's a rebirth of some of that. So you have, you have really linear stuff, like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, a Renaissance man. It's very much build to scale. It's like the opposite of the Romantic era, and it's kind of the Romantic era is like a revolution of the classical and Renaissance era. But it's very to scale drawing and stuff like that. So, about 1450, you have Johannes Gutenberg. Excuse me. He was born 1452. Da Vinci was born. Fall of Constantinople happened right after Da Vinci's birth. Kind of cool. He actually happened before the Renaissance era, technically, right? Kind of cool. 1475, Michelangelo was born. Very important guy. He painted the Sistine Chapel. Blah blah blah. Right? Cool guy. By the way, green, important stuff, events, whatever. Green is the special, unique stuff about that era. Blue are the people, and then black is just the times. So then moving on from Michelangelo, moving on to 1483, with Martin Luther was born, and then also Raphael was born. They were born the same year. Pretty cool stuff. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1500, nothing much. A little bit later than that, the 95 Theses by Martin Luther, about 1515-ish. 1520s, Copernicus proved that the Earth was round. Surprise, right? Anyway, 1550, you had Giovanni Gabrieli. And then later than that, you had William Shakespeare. And then about 1609, the Galileo and his telescope, learning that Jupiter had rings or moons, or Saturn had a ring and Jupiter had moons, and then our moon has craters and stuff. So pretty cool stuff. But overall, the Renaissance was a rebirth of learning. That's what you got to know here. Just rebirth, mostly polyphonic music when it comes to that. Moving on to the Baroque era. So this is now the 1600s to the 1750s, right? It's going to get a little hard for me to read down here. So bear with me, right? In fact, we'll make it a special for both of us. We'll hold it up like a baby or something. So about 16... So anyway, so stuff that you need to know about the Baroque era. It was... Alright, so the Renaissance was a rebirth. Baroque is ornate. It's like gaudy, like gold plated, very like showy, right? Like cheap, like never mind, not cheap. I was thinking something else, but anyway, the thing about these people, lots of music. Prolific is the word that was used in your writings. Vast amount of music, like castratos. So those were this. They believed that women weren't allowed to sing because of a very literal translation and understanding of the Bible. Somehow, the females are less than men or something. They can't sing and they should keep silent in church. So you had boys that would have their testicles cut off, and then they actually ended up being really amazing singers. But anyway, yeah. So during the Baroque era, you also had kind of a combination of polyphonic music and monophonic music, as well as a invention of monody music, which was monophonic music with a soloist. So that was pretty cool. The soloist didn't have any legit rules that they had to abide by. In fact, they often embellished their solo a lot. It's getting too long. Opera houses start about in the Baroque era. For the different genre, you had the oratorio, the opera, the cantata, the canon, the suite, the sonata, the concert, the fugue. The fugue is definitely a Baroque era mainstay, or unique ability, or what's the word? Unique. It's unique to the Baroque era. I feel like I don't see a lot of it in the classical and stuff, but you do see sonatas and concerts and stuff like that in the later eras. Anyway, moving on to 1659, Henry Purcell was born, big guy in the Baroque era, but honestly not as big as Bach. When you think of fugues I think of Bach. Anyway, Handel and Bach were born in 1685, as well as Antonio Vivaldi right before them at 1678. Moving on to 1695, Purcell, that was when he published or composed his Young Person's Guide to Orchestra, which was one of our listening thingies. He's just known for that, so I put that in here. And then 1710, Handel takes that job in Southern Europe, but he gets a year off and goes to the UK for a bit. I put that in there. 1721, George Telemann becomes the director of Hamburg. There's just not a lot going on in the Baroque era, because just a lot of composing and stuff going on. And that's the gist for the base of the rest of it. There's not a whole lot of important events, more so until the 20th century, more so just a lot of composing with only a couple of mentioned artists. Obviously there's a lot of artists, it's hard to get to all of them. Alright, moving on to the classical era, 1750 to 1825-ish. The unique stuff for that, where the Baroque era was ornate, the classical era will be considered elegant. I like to think of it also as kind of a minimalist, but realistically, that's mentioned in the 20th century. Minimalism doesn't really happen, but I always find the homophonic classical music just seems so almost minimalist to me compared to the Baroque era, right? But we like to say elegant in this case. Like I mentioned, it's mostly homophonic music. The cool thing about the classical era that I didn't realize before doing this was that the classical era is all it's mostly like a 20, like the symphonies were 20 minutes. That's insane. That's so much more enjoyable than, moving on to the Romantic era when they move into hour-long sessions or more. Anyway. Excuse me, my hand's getting tired. As far as the genres go, you've got a sonata, concerto, opera, the string quartet, the symphony. So some of the same words are moving around. You'll see that a lot, but definitely still different. The forms that are new to this are like the sonata, which is named after the genre. Don't get it confused. And then theme and variations, also stuff like cyclic, repetition and stuff like that, and like the big symphonies. Also, the piano was invented during this time. Huge, kind of like a musical revolution, or when it came to composing, because now you had this pianoforte that had a huge range in the sound levels it could make. Piano small, loud, pianoforte. Anyway, 1732, Haydn was born, composer. Not like 1750, that was the death of Bach, so that's when the classical era starts. It's actually right here in the middle. In 1756, Mozart was born. 1770, Beethoven was born, and Beethoven and Bach were transition from classical era to the Romantic era. Really more like, I feel like, Romantic era composers, but they did start composing classical music when they were first around, and then they switched. Or I guess they just kind of, there's no switching, right? It's just like evolution just kind of gradually changes. Anyway, so Romantic era is from the 1800 to the 1900s. And so, whereas Baroque was ornate, classical was elegant, the Romantic is going to be dramatic. Dramatic. I mean, there's no other way to say it. The Romantic era was a dramatic time. It was right after the American Revolution, right after the French Revolution. I mean, people were just all over the place. They were revolting against, basically against the aristocracy, the rich people. They had enough of them. They were tired of dealing with them, and so the middle class started doing their own thing. And that's what the Romantic era is about. It's basically about middle class taking over the arts. So that's where you see a huge change in a lot of things. As far as the arts go, they like to focus on untamed nature. But getting back to the huge change, symphonies became long, huge deals. You had program versus absolute music. Absolute music being music just for the sake of music. Program music being music for a purpose. And this is where cyclic form came into play, because with these long, hour-long symphonies, you had a lot of repetition, and so for these long ones, they just call it cyclic, like a repeating theme. It's kind of like theme and variations. Okay, so Wagner was born in 1813-ish. He came up with music dramas because he didn't like operas or whatever. He was too good for them. I don't know. Weird dude, right? It's actually written. I do know. 1815, valves were created or invented for brass instruments like the trumpet. This was pretty awesome. 1827 and 28, Beethoven and Schubert died. So, that's like the end of that transition phase, kind of. Obviously, their music didn't end. Like, their music is still a big part. Anyway. 1840, Tchaikovsky was born. He's a Russian composer. Honestly, that guy. I like his. The symphony. I think it's the Planets. I'm a big fan personally, but like a lot of. I'd say even a lot of like John Williams takes a lot from him, from that Planets. You can kind of hear in like stuff like Jurassic Park and stuff, and maybe even Star Wars. But cool stuff. He was an interesting guy because he was Russian, and so nationalism was a big part of this, and so being distinct from other people. So the Russians wanted to be Russian and not be Western music and not have Western music, and Tchaikovsky kind of tried to go in the middle. That was kind of funny because it ended up being that the Russians didn't like his music because it was too Western for a good Russian. And then the Western people didn't like it because it was too Russian for a good Western music-loving person, right? Anyway, so he wasn't really appreciated as much, I feel like, as he probably should have been at the time. But anyway, moving on to the transitional phase between the Romantic Era and the 20th century. You had Claude Debussy and Mahler in 1860-ish, same time as about the Civil War. The phonograph was invented by Edison in 1877, and then in 1897, the first radio station started, and then we hit 1900. So, the turning point of that century. And then we had the 20th century right there. So, moving on. So, whereas the Romantic Era was dramatic and revolting against the Classical Era, the 20th century is just a complex time. Lots of innovation, lots of like mild revolt. I mean, you had like 5 wars in the 20th century, like almost world wars, and you had 2 world wars. You had the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Anyway, so we got a general trend to innovate, right? Like I was saying, it's changing. There's just inventions happening all over the place. With the invention of the radio takes over by 1920. In the Roaring '20s, you think of the radio stations, right? That's what's going on here. In order to convey the sadness of war, that you started using a lot more dissonance. So that was cool for that time period. And honestly, it's still a big thing. Even just in like pop culture music too. Sometimes you'll hear like a dissonant, and it'll change. I forget the word is, but it'll go back to like being nice. So also with the 20th century is that you have a huge specialization of music skills. So whereas the Romantic Era, they stopped a lot of the, so like for example the Baroque Era, really strong musicians, really strong. They could do amazing things. Classical Era and Romantic Era started dropping away from that and going more towards just being an average player with a better instrument, as well as having more of them. So anyway, back to 20th century specialization. You had jazz, rock. You just can't go from jazz to classical or to playing, this kind of music so quickly. It's hard. I've played both, and I'm sure you've played way more than I have. It's hard. It's like turning a switch. As well as like I did brass instruments, so my mouth was just not used to it at all. I can't imagine, because with a jazz instrument, you're hitting. It's almost like you're just slurring so many different notes. I can't imagine trying to learn on jazz and then switch to something so precise. Obviously, jazz is hard. Like I said, I couldn't do jazz, but so right before 1900 hit, you had a lot of the expressionist were born. So that was the German like competition for the French Impressionists. So the French had the Impressionists talking about light reflecting off of surfaces as like an outward kind of push, right? And then you had the Germans saying, "Oh, well, we're gonna go inward," and so they went inward. And so stuff like the Scream was expressionist, kind of just using different colors and almost like a random scheme. But so you had Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, Alban Berg. That was about 1880ish. They were born, and so that really allowed them to control the expressionists during the early 20th century. World War I was 1914 to 1918. I think 1917. Ended right about there. And then moving on from there, the 1930s with the Great Depression. Well, 1929 to the 1935ish Great Depression. That wasn't just America. That was the whole world. Okay, when the American dollar goes down, everyone suffers, especially now with trade literally being like, that's a different topic. But anyway, like I said before, 1920s, the radio had taken over. Minimalism happened about 1940 was when they were born. That was a revolt against expressionism. I mean, it's just literally, it just reminds me of parents and children. The parents do their thing, and children, well, I don't like how they did it, I'm going to do the opposite. And it just goes back and forth almost. And so anyway, so you had minimalism with Steve Reich, John Adams, and Philip Glass. They were born 1940-ish. Then 1950, you had the Korean War. That was about 3 years long. 1955 all the way to 1975, you had a 20-year Vietnam War. We were only in there for about 13 years as America, but that was going on for a long time. And then there was some more stuff that's not really important compared to the 20th century music that we talked about anyway. Obviously, the hundreds of genres, probably thousands of genres at this point, of pop culture music and rock and would definitely fit in here. Obviously, I mean, honestly, you could go decade by decade of the 20th century, had vastly different musics. The 80s compared to the 90s. The 80s, electronic versus the 90s alternative rock, is just way different. But all in all, this is the timeline of known music that we've talked about. So pretty cool stuff. Like I said, I'll send you the picture. Hopefully be a much better quality so you can actually see it and grade me on that. But thank you for listening to my 30-minute presentation. So, like I said, 6 eras and a lot of fun stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching. Pretty sure I did all that. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a great one.